I remember the morning light like a question I couldn't answer. It slid across the kitchen table in thin, honest strips, while I leaned over the coffee maker, fumbling with the timer because my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The radio murmured the usual traffic updates. Dave's voice, soft, ridiculous, was already on his way out the door with a last kiss that tasted like toothpaste and the kind of small promises you make and mean in the moment. I watched him go, his work badge catching the sun, the zipper of his jacket flashing like a private signal. He waved. I waved back. That should have been the end of the scene. That should have been the safe, ordinary thing it was the day before, and the day before that. Instead, the world learned how quickly ordinary can be dismantled. I have rehearsed the timeline in my head 1,000 times, the way you rehearse an obituary, methodically, with cold practicality. I know that at 8:46 a.m. Eastern, the first plane hit. I know I was 4 subway stops from the World Trade Center. I know that by the time I reached the lobby of Tower 2, by the time I smelled smoke and felt heat, and began to understand that the day had been ripped out from under us, my life had already bifurcated into before and after. But what I remember most is the smallness. The paper cup of coffee in my hand, the lint on the sleeve of my coat, the echo of a child's laughter somewhere above ground, as if the city didn't yet understand what was unfolding. When the building shook, I remember thinking it was the subway rumbling, like any other tremor. The ceiling lights swayed. People clutched their bags. Someone laughed in a high, nervous sound that could have been a joke. Then the intercom cut through with that flat corporate voice, "Please proceed to the stairwells." I turned because everyone turned, because you turn in the face of instruction, and saw him. Not my husband, not yet, not Dave. A man near the doorway, in a suit too expensive for someone who answers his own voicemail, was on the phone. His face was a map of disbelief. He folded himself into movement the way the rest of us did. Feet clumsy, human. That man would matter to me later. At that moment, he was simply another person trying to get out. I should have reached for his hand then. I should have known the strange alchemy of strangers in crisis, how you can become someone's anchor because your voice is steady, or because you look like you know how to keep a rhythm. Instead, I kept my hands near my chest, like a child clutching a blanket, and descended the stairwell with the rest of the building. We went down, and the stairwell smelled of recycled air and the metallic tang of fear. People whispered and prayed and cursed. The fluorescent lights hummed like something that might give out at any second. I made it to the street because the people around me made sure we all made it. We flowed out of the building like a slow river that had been redirected. The air was not the cool morning air I had expected. It was thick with dust and a strange, peppery smoke that clung to my throat. Above us, black smoke coiled, an obscene, living thing climbing into the sky. It happened fast, and then it happened slower, in the terrible way trauma slows your perception. Everyone moved in a pattern of panic, but within me, time stretched into an almost clinical observation. I found a payphone, because back then we still used them, and I tried Dave's cell. No answer. I called again. No answer. I called his office. Static. I called the number of a friend at the building, anyone who could tell me he was okay. Nothing. The world made the ordinary channels fail first, as if testing how much I could hold. The first day became a maze of small, unbearable tasks that had to be completed. I needed to know. I needed to find him. I remember the way the volunteers outside the temporary command center moved, their bright vests like beacons. I remember the smell of antiseptic and coffee. Coffee. And the way strangers handed out bottles of water and wrapped blankets around shoulders. People said things in fragments. We saw people. Did anyone hear from? And everyone kept hoping for the wrong kind of miracle. Someone walking out of the rubble with a coat sleeve clean and a smile. 3 days later, I was sleeping on a cot at St. Vincent's, clutching a paper cup like it would tether me to life. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and the odd domesticity of donated knit hats. Volunteers sifted through names and photos, taped flyers to poles, made lists that grew faster than they could be checked. Sleep for me was stuttered. made of dreams that slipped into the memory of concrete and flame. I kept replaying small moments I could not set right. The cup of coffee that spilled when I ran down the stairs, the way I had not grabbed his briefcase when I might have been able to find it, the stranger in the stairwell who told me about his brother and then walked away. Each fragment felt like an accusation. You blame yourself for being out of step with fate's cruelty because guilt is some perverse human engine that keeps you moving. A week after, I sat on a folding chair in front of a table that had been turned into an ad hoc registry for survivors. The woman behind the table handled the clipboard with both determination and a softness that looked like grief. She read my name aloud and checked a box that said, "Missing." The word felt like a hole opening. People spoke through their teeth, counting names, wrapping them in plastic sleeves like precious things. Someone handed me a list of volunteers who had seen things, who had pulled someone out and watched life leave them. I scanned the lists with an animal's focus. No Dave. The city gave me protocols, pamphlets, counselors with soft voices who told me what to expect in the weeks ahead. The classic stages of grief as though it could be scheduled. "There are stages," they said. "You will move through them." There was no mention of the strange, sticky, permanent thing that comes after. The phantom sounds, the sudden tears when you smell someone else's cologne, the way every elevator makes you hold your breath. I want you to understand what the trauma did to me physically, not because pathology is drama, but because bodies keep the ledger grief opens. For months, I had a phantom throat. I would choke on nothing, the muscles remembering smoke and the angle of falling debris. I jumped at the slam of doors. Crowds felt like traps. I would position myself near exits, always near exits, fingers curling into imaginary keys. I developed a ritual of scanning, a building's exits, the number of stairs, the way people were positioned. On good days, it was what kept me alive. On bad days, it felt like a prison within which the city was magnified into potential harm. But trauma isn't only assault and fear. It's also the things trauma steals and replaces. I remember in the months after, standing on the corner where Dave used to kiss my cheek in the wash of late afternoon light. A woman passed by with a child the same age as our niece, hair in a messy ponytail, sneakers scuffed, the same easy occupation with life that had once been ours. I suddenly felt like I was watching someone through glass. The woman laughed at something small, and the sound hammered through me. Grief and rage tangled together. I began to measure everything against what had been, and what might have been. In the nights, I listened to the city and cataloged the sounds. The delivery trucks like distant thunder, the taxi horns like arguments, the faint hum of a television from an upstairs window. Each sound had a weight. Each sound could be a threat. People tried to help, and often they did. Neighbors brought casseroles that lasted 3 days in my refrigerator. Coworkers called and left messages I couldn't listen to, their voices polite and then raw. My mother flew in and tried to mother me with the same hands that had once smoothed my hair after a scraped knee. There is tender cruelty in maternal comfort when the wound is not physical. She suggested long walks, sunlight, grief groups. I went to grief groups because it seemed like the polite thing to do. They helped until they didn't. There is only so much another person's suffering can mirror yours before it becomes a mirror you refuse to look into. One tiny subplot wove itself into the mornings. My friend Maria's insistence that I come to her church on Sundays. Maria believed in the neat logic of prayer. You say the words, and God rearranges the world. She would take my hand and say, "You don't have to carry this alone," as if carrying were simply a physical act you could set down. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe in anything that offered a map. But faith has its own fragile architecture, and mine had been dismantled. I would go sometimes, in the early days, because it felt like being in a room where people acknowledged pain without making demands. A small kindness. Later, though, I stopped. My absence from the pews became another kind of confession. I could not yet stand the ritual of answered prayers because my prayers felt unfinished. Another thread tugged at me. The legal tangle of insurance claims, lost documents, the bureaucratic machinery that grinds hope into forms. There were forms to open bank accounts for missing persons, forms to file with the employer, forms that demanded that I list Dave's details as if he had been an object mislaid. Paperwork is a peculiar indignity after trauma, an insistence that life reorder itself into boxes you check. I found myself alternating between furious clarity, this is unjust, this is wrong, and a queer, dull exhaustion where every demand felt like another weight. Then there were visits to the river, because grief needs geography. I would walk along the Hudson and watch barges move like slow, deliberate clocks. Sometimes I would sit and remember him. The small ways he liked his coffee, the way he hummed when he mowed the lawn, how he would pick at the wedding ring the way some people pick at threads. I could feel the absence like a physical presence at my side, an imaginary person with the warmth of someone who had been. People told me not to isolate. People meant well. People could not understand the private architecture grief builds. One afternoon, months after, I went back to the stairwell. Buildings have stairwells like veins, secret conduits that carry the weight of a place. I wanted to stand where people had pushed and pulled and jammed themselves into narrow spaces. I wanted to know what it was to be where the city had been most human. I climbed the steps slowly, 3 at a time at first, then 1. And when I reached the landing, I found a man I recognized from that day. Not Dave. Another face that had folded into my memory like a pressed flower. He was thinner than I remembered, hollowed into something grief had carved. We did not speak immediately. We sat on the landing like conspirators of a shared history. He told me then about his brother, who had worked several floors above where he did, about the calls that cut off, about the coal-like weight of waiting. He admitted, in a voice that was a dry thread, that for a time he'd imagined he heard the building breathe, an impossible memory that nevertheless felt like the most honest witness. Our confessions were small and precise, the smells we could not forget, the way certain numbers triggered panic. We traded techniques like a secret language, the way to breathe through the diaphragm, what to say when an elevator stuck, how to hold a child's hand so they did not feel the trembling in your own fingers. The man's presence became one of the constellations in my new sky. Not a saving star, not a miracle, just a fellow person who could say, I know, and have it mean something. We became a subplot of sorts. 2 survivors walking the same city, making new arrangements with the world. We could not promise each other tomorrow, only the small, stubborn promise of company. Sometimes that was enough. But trauma returns in cycles, not lines. Anniversaries for me were a kind of ambush. The first anniversary, 1 year later, arrived with a depth I did not anticipate. The day arrived not as a memory, but as a physical environment. The sky too bright, the flags too sharp, the news coverage too insistent. I woke early and found myself in a hyper-precise ritual, dressing like armor, checking the door locks as if the city might once again fold. I attended memorials because the city insisted on honoring itself, and for reasons I couldn't entirely articulate, I needed to be there. The memorials were beautiful and terrible, full of names etched like wounds. I pressed my palm to marble and felt cold, and the echo of all those absent hands. I left with my throat raw and my hands trembling. Microhooks are supposed to be small shocks, and here, in the middle of the second year, one found me when I least expected it. The smell of burnt bread from a bakery across the street and the immediate, visceral recoil of memory. I dropped my grocery bag and crouched on the sidewalk, shaking as if someone had punched me. A child asked if I was all right, and a woman helped me to my feet. The world kept moving, and I kept learning how to move with it, awkward and raw, and sometimes graceful. There are more pieces: court hearings, benefit concerts, the strange kindness of strangers who had lost as well. Threads that braided into a life that refused to be only its wound. Sometimes, in the late hours, I would write letters I never sent, pages of "what if" and "remember when," because the act of writing was a rehearsal, a way to keep my memory from dissolving. I wrote about him the way you write about a ghost you still love. I would read those pages with my eyes closed and feel both better and worse for it. Better because the love persisted, worse because the letters affirmed absence. I don't know if this counts as surviving in the heroic sense. When people use that word, survivor, they often expect a neat arc, trauma, confrontation, triumph. My survival has been less cinematic and more like a long apprenticeship in learning how to live with fracture. Sometimes the fracture sharpened me into gratitude. Sometimes it left me raw and furious. I have days where the past punctures the present like a needle, and others where I am astonished by the ordinary pleasures that reassert themselves. A good meal, a friend's laugh, the steady predictability of the seasons. There is one truth I carry always. Grief does not close like a door. It folds and rearranges your rooms. It invites its own furniture. You learn to host it without letting it be your only guest. The man I once watched in the stairwell, he and I developed a cadence of friendship that, for a while, felt like living proof that trauma could make new kinds of intimacy. We married our memories with small acts of care, coffee on cold mornings, a phone call just to say, "I remembered you were not alone today." And they mattered in that modest, human way. I do not want my story to be a catalog of loss alone. Loss is legible. It is a thing you can point to. Trauma's other shape is resilience of a quieter sort. The choice to keep making lunches for a niece you see sometimes. The stubbornness of planting lavender in a small balcony pot. The way you learn to name your triggers so they lose some of their power. I still have nights when I wake and cannot remember whether the last sound was a dream or a memory, when an ambulance passes and my hands go to my throat. But then I count out a breathing exercise and name 3 things in the room that are ordinary and present, and the world rights itself again, temporarily and marvelously. I suppose if someone asks me now whether I was changed by that day, I would say yes, changed down to the bones. I forgot things that I thought were permanent, and I discovered strengths I did not know I had. I learned the precise, small language of survival, to carry photographs in a zipped pocket, to memorize the creak of a particular stair in my building, to keep a list of emergency numbers not buried in my phone, but on paper. I learned how to ask for help and how to refuse it when it wasn't right for me. Most of all, I learned that love persists in strange, patient ways. It is not always the grand rescue. Sometimes it is the rhythm of a friend's texts, the neighbor's conservative casserole, the volunteer who hands you a blanket and does not ask for anything in return. The story continues. There are days when I pretend to myself that the city is an indifferent but steady machine. There are other days when memory is a sharp, tender thing that pierces me without mercy. But I keep going. I go because I must, because there are small, stubborn kindnesses that make life worthwhile. Because somewhere, in the scraped-away landscape of that time, new things have taken root. I keep a photograph of him in my wallet, him mid-laugh, hair unruly, the sun in his eyes, and I look at it sometimes and speak to him like a ritual. There are chapters I haven't told you yet. A visit to a place that smelled like cedar and made me cry. A friendship that became the kind of love that is steady but not romantic. The slow, patient work of therapy that is less dramatic than people expect, but more effective. I will tell you those in time, because this is not an ending. It is a life continuing, sometimes in grief's shadow, sometimes in the light it allows between its fingers. For now, I will leave you with a small, stubborn fact. I am here. I am breathing. I remember. And however jagged the path, I keep walking it one step at a time. I used to think closure was something loud. A door slamming, a verdict read, a final declaration that the past had been neatly folded and stored away. But the truth is, closure is quiet, almost shy. It shows up in the ordinary moments you never thought would feel safe again. A folded shirt that no longer smells like grief. A morning that doesn't begin with dread's familiar throb. The first time you laugh without guilt. For me, closure began on a cold March morning, more than 2 years after the towers fell. I was pouring coffee into my chipped blue mug, the one Dave bought at a roadside stand on our 5th anniversary, when my hand stopped shaking for the first time in months. It was such a small difference that I almost missed it. The calm in my fingers felt foreign, as if I were borrowing someone else's steadiness. I stood there in my kitchen, the steam rising in soft curls, and realized I could finally breathe without counting each inhale like a promise I might break. The therapist I'd been seeing, Dr. Keene, with her calm voice and her office that always smelled faintly of eucalyptus, once told me that healing doesn't happen all at once. She said, "You'll move through life like you're learning to walk again. Some days you'll sprint. Some days you'll crawl. Both are progress." I didn't believe her then. But standing with that cup, my pulse steady, my breath even, I felt something unclench inside me. And still, the world had ways of testing my progress. A week after that morning, I returned to the memorial site for the first time alone. Not during a ceremony. Not surrounded by crowds or speeches or the well-meaning noise of collective grief. Just me. The sky was pale blue, the kind that looks newly washed. There was a biting wind off the river that crept down my sleeves, but it felt clean, almost bracing. I walked slowly, tracing my fingers along the smooth stone edges of the North Pool. Water spilled in perfect sheets, as if the earth itself had learned how to weep in a dignified way. I stood there for a long time, reading names I recognized and names I didn't. When I found Dave's, my legs wavered. His name was cool beneath my fingertips. For the first time, touching it didn't feel like pressing on a bruise. It felt like greeting someone I hadn't seen in a while, someone I still loved, someone who, strangely, no longer felt lost, someone who felt remembered. I whispered, "I'm okay," and the truth of the words surprised me. I wasn't whole. That would imply restoration. But I was here. I was living. I was allowed to be okay. When the wind shifted, I stepped back and noticed the man from the stairwell, Evan, standing near one of the benches. He must have seen me earlier but given me space. That was something he'd always understood instinctively. His own grief had carved him into someone patient. "You ready?" he asked when I walked over. "I think I might be," I said. We started walking together. It had become a ritual for us, meeting every few weeks, sometimes talking, sometimes simply passing through the city as if mapping new routes through our shared history. Over the years, our friendship had become solid, familiar, a quiet pillar rather than a dramatic salvation. People love to romanticize trauma-bonded connections, but ours had always been something gentler, something without the pressure to transform into a love story. It was connection, unadorned. A place where both of us could set our burdens down for a moment and breathe without apology. We walked toward Battery Park, the wind sharp enough to sting our cheeks. The Hudson glimmered like a broken mirror, reflecting bits of sky that looked too soft for a city so scarred. "You've changed," he said quietly. "Better or worse?" "Better," he answered. "Stronger." I didn't know how to respond. Compliments about strength always felt complicated. Strength implied choice, willpower, triumph. My survival still felt like a mix of blind instinct, unlikely luck, and the stubborn pull of life itself. But I nodded and let his words settle, because maybe there was truth in them. Maybe strength wasn't the loud, heroic thing I once imagined. Maybe strength was simpler. Waking up on a morning you feared, taking a step even when your legs trembled. We reached a bench overlooking the water. The Statue of Liberty stood in the distance, the same steady figure she had always been, witness to every grief and every hopeful arrival. I used to look at her and feel nothing but irony, that symbol of freedom overlooking a city that had been brought to its knees. But now she felt like a reminder that endurance is made of small efforts repeated over time. I sat, tucking my hands into my coat sleeves. "Do you ever think about starting over?" I asked. "Every day," he admitted. "But starting over doesn't mean forgetting. It just means you carry things differently. I guess I'm learning how to do that." "You're doing better than you think." A gull screeched overhead, its wings slicing the cold air. For a moment, Life felt almost normal in that quiet, chaotic New York way. Boats honked on the river. A child ran past us laughing. A woman walking her dog hummed to herself. The world kept spinning, the city kept moving, and somehow I was a part of it again. I told Evan I wanted to try something new, something bold, maybe reckless, but deeply necessary. "I'm thinking about leaving my job," I said. His eyebrows lifted. "Really?" For years I'd been working in the same office, safe, predictable, quiet. It had been a refuge after the towers, a place where I could control my environment and avoid the chaos of the outside world. But lately, the walls had started to feel too close, the fluorescent lights too dim, the air too stale. "I want to work with trauma survivors," I said. My voice surprised me with its clarity. "Not as a therapist. I'm not ready for that. But maybe as a coordinator, or a speaker, or someone who helps survivors feel less alone." He nodded slowly. "You'd be good at that." "Do you think so?" "I know so." And somehow, I believed him. The next month became a small revolution in my life. I handed in my resignation, my hands trembling only half as much as they once had, packed up my desk, and walked out into the bright spring air feeling lighter than I'd felt in years. I contacted a local trauma support network, the same one that had helped me in the early days, and asked if they had volunteer opportunities. They said yes. On my first day, I sat in a circle with people who were shaking the same way I once had. People whose wounds were still tender, raw, open. People who needed someone to say, "You are allowed to be broken. You are allowed to heal at your own pace." I didn't tell them my full story, not at first. I just listened. I offered tissues. I made tea. I let them breathe in whatever rhythm they needed. And as I listened to their stories, car crashes, fires, assaults, losses that had no names, I realized something profound. Trauma changes shape when shared. It doesn't disappear, but it becomes less suffocating, less monstrous. I saw relief in their eyes when they understood they weren't alone. And in giving them that relief, I found a strange, powerful peace. My healing no longer felt like something I owed to myself alone. It felt like something connected to others, like a chain of lanterns passing light forward. I began attending therapy more consistently, not because I was drowning, but because I was learning to swim. I built new routines, morning walks, evening journals, lunches with friends I had once pushed away because grief had made my world too small. My mother visited more often, and instead of hovering, she simply sat with me, knitting in silence, sipping tea. The silence between us felt full instead of empty. Evan and I still walked together, but one warm summer afternoon, after years of shared healing, we decided that our paths were gently diverging. Not because of anger, not because of distance, but because we no longer needed each other in the same way. "We saved each other when we needed saving," he said. "That's enough." And it was. We hugged, long, steady, grateful, and then we walked in different directions. I didn't cry. The ending felt right, like setting something precious on a shelf with care instead of dropping it. Months passed. The seasons turned. Life began building itself around me in ways I didn't expect. One September morning, the anniversary, I woke not with dread, but with quiet clarity. I walked to the memorial again. I brought a single white rose. I touched Dave's name, not with trembling, but with something like peace. I whispered, "Thank you for loving me." And for the first time, I didn't feel like the words were a plea. They were a gift. Then I stepped back, inhaled, and let the air fill every corner of my lungs. I realized something then, something simple, almost embarrassingly obvious. The future wasn't something that would return to me. It was something I had to walk toward. And I was ready. I left the memorial and walked north along the river. The city buzzed with life all around me. Horns, laughter, the rush of footsteps, the sense of street vendors grilling meat and chestnuts. It no longer felt overwhelming. It felt orchestral. As I walked, I thought about the people I had helped, The stories I had heard, the letters I had written in the lonely early years. I thought about the nights I woke shaking, and how now, finally, those nights came less often. I thought about love, not the fairy tale kind, but the enduring kind. Love that persists across time. Love that reshapes itself. Love that doesn't need to be replaced to remain real. Near West 80th Street, I passed a small cafe I'd never noticed before. Something about it, maybe the twinkling lights around the doorway, maybe the soft murmur of jazz drifting into the sidewalk, pulled me inside. I ordered a cappuccino and sat by the window, watching the rain begin to fall. The drops slid down the glass in soft trails. For a moment, the world felt suspended, almost sacred. I opened my journal and wrote, "I survived. Not by accident, not by miracle, but by choosing to keep living." It was the truest sentence I had ever written. A barista passed by and smiled at me. A stranger held the door for an older woman coming in. A man outside jogged through the rain, laughing at the sky. Life, messy and mundane and beautiful, kept happening, and I was in it again. That was the moment I knew, not hoped, not guessed, but knew, that my story wasn't a story of loss anymore. It was a story of transformation, a story of carrying the past with tenderness instead of torment, a story of finding a way to build again, gently, deliberately. The trauma didn't vanish, the memories didn't fade, but they no longer ruled me. They became part of me the way scars do, permanent, but no longer painful to touch. A reminder of what I lived through, a testament to what I rebuilt. I finished my coffee, closed my journal, watched the rain soften into a drizzle, and stepped back into the city, my city, with steady lungs and a steady heart. This was not the ending I once begged for. It was better. It was mine. And as I walked uptown through the soft rain, I whispered to myself, not as a wish, but as a truth. I am here. I am alive. I am whole enough. And the city, in its restless, tireless way, seemed to whisper back, "Welcome home."